I'm Jordan Copeland. I'm the Scarsdale Village Historian. Thanks so much for coming. I see a lot of the usual historically minded people here and some new faces, so that's really nice to see. Today, what I'm gonna give you a presentation about how Scarsdale became Scarsdale. The thesis of this is that Scarsdale, as we know it, was not inevitable. The creation of Scarsdale was the result of some geographic chance, as well as some very deliberate decisions made along the way, some with foresight, some accidental, some community-minded, some self-interested, that all conspired to turn Scarsdale into what we know it today. So, where it really started was in the first half of the 20th century, where the identity formed, but in order to really understand how that scene was set, I'm going to give you some context for it. So, this is the basic outline of how things worked. So basically from Scarsdale's founding as a manor in 1701 up till about the 1840s, Scarsdale was a landlocked farming area. Then what you wind up having is, and I'll go over these in depth a little bit later, the railroad comes, that's a big change. You get initial suburbanization in the early part of the 20th century. Then you have a real flourishing in the teens and the 20s, where things really develop. Then post-war, there's some changes in society. But we're going to talk about first about the landlocked farming area that Scarsdale was. And this is a really interesting thing to think about if you think of Scarsdale as being very central today as a benefit. And once upon a time, that was not such a benefit. So, the top photo is from Mamaroneck. The bottom photo is from our post office downtown. So, the top photo, this is the dramatization of John Richbell's purchase, whatever that meant at the time, in 1661 of Scarsdale and Mamaroneck and part of Harrison from the Native Americans. He came up from Barbados. And so you see the top photo here, this being John Richbell, this being one of the local sachems. Then 40 years later, Caleb Heathcote comes in after Richbell dies. So this is down here, him on the bottom, the yellow, with Richbell's widow standing next to him. And this very, very heavily dramatized. We can guarantee that in 1701, there was never this density of people anywhere. Very, very, very sparse. In another presentation, I talk about an early census in which there were 12 people in the entire manor of Scarsdale, which consisted of Scarsdale and Mamaroneck, of which 7 or 8 were enslaved African people, and the rest were Heathcote and his family. The center of that time really was Mamaroneck. So Caleb Heathcote's home was in Mamaroneck. I'm going to guess that all of you have spent more time in Scarsdale than Caleb Heathcote did. Caleb Heathcote he had the whole area, but he chose to live in Mamaroneck, closer to the water. You're going to see how that's relevant in a second. And at part of the time, he was mayor of New York City as well. And if you want to either encourage your children or feel guilty about your accomplishments, he was mayor of New York City at the same time that his brother was Lord Mayor of London. Obviously, these weren't elected positions, it's connections and all that, but it's a pretty accomplished duo. So you had this whole manor that stretched down. It was the last manor in Colonial Westchester, probably the least desired one because it was landlocked, unlike everything else along the shore. He died in 1721. It passed to his children, his daughters, and it was eventually sold off to the tenant farmers. And this is obviously a much later photo, but this would have been basically what Scarsdale looked like for a long, long time. This is Crane Berkeley. What's now Crane Berkeley. Post Road is up here. And this would be like where the pond is. This was the Barry farm. And by the way, all this is being recorded, so I'll put it on YouTube, and then if you want to slow down and look at something close up because you're too far away, that's fine. So until after the Civil War, Scarsdale was really all about the farming. And here is the populations. I kind of put this down together. I'm going to have another presentation about this estimated. So just to orient yourself, we've got Scarsdale, the horse's head of Scarsdale up here. Then you've got Greenburgh, you've got Yonkers over here, you've got Eastchester, you've got Pelham, New Rochelle, Mamaroneck. Post the Revolution, Scarsdale was split. The manor was split into Mamaroneck and Scarsdale. So I know it's a lot to digest here, but what's interesting about it is the population of Scarsdale being estimated 330 at that time. Everything around it, you see right next door, Mamaroneck is 4 to 5 times the size with a similar volume of land or area of land. Same thing with New Rochelle, much, much larger. Everything is much, much larger. What all of those neighboring communities have in common, that Scarsdale does not, is access to the water. They all have Hudson River access along the left side, so you could start to have industry and transport. If you're a farmer and you want to grow things that aren't just to support yourself, you want to get your crops down to where other people live, perhaps New York City. And on this map, and I'll zoom in a second, the only way to get down to New York City would be along Post Road, which at that point was this kind of twisty, windy path that led down. Difficult to get your stuff out, not very efficient. And I'll show you a couple things in a preview, something that's going to happen in a couple hundred years in my presentation. First of all, you'll notice, this is just sort of an aside, but it's worth knowing. So this is an 1840 map. You see here all the towns. You see a town of Westchester. If you're familiar with the geography, you know that now is the Bronx, right? And Westchester Square in the Bronx was the seat of Westchester, the town of Westchester. So essentially, our county seat was the town of Westchester in the county of Westchester, and that was in 1874. The whole area west of the Bronx River was annexed by New York City, and 2 decades later, the whole area east of that was annexed by the New York City. Plus, and I know you haven't had long to digest this map, but Eastchester today does not have water access, but it did then. Pelham, all of this was also chopped off and taken. This area was carved out. They created the city of Mount Vernon. Yonkers lost a whole bunch to the Bronx. Pelham, down here you can see City Island, Pelham Bay Park, Orchard Beach. All of these were originally part of Pelham. They were eaten up, became part of the Bronx. So this map is from 1840, and this all happened towards the close of the 1800s. Towns did not have control over their borders. So when New York City goes knocking to Albany saying we need room to expand, the legislature is able to change the borders of the towns and give that property to another municipality. So that's kind of interesting. Then I will point out, zoom in a little bit. So this is the same map, 1840. You got the Horse's Head of Scarsdale. We are right about the A is the library right now. And what's really interesting about this is that there's really 5 roads in Scarsdale. That's it in 1840. And they're pretty much the same 5 roads that were there in colonial times. In other words, there wasn't a need over this era to develop, to build more roads or anything like that. So you had Post Road, which was an Indian trail, Native American trail. Then in 1717, it was turned into an actual road. You had Weaver Street, which was in 1720, and originally went up and it stopped at Crossway. It didn't continue on up to the 5 corners. There was no 5 corners. Heathcote Road itself didn't come in until 1909. So this was, way, way far. So these were just roads that you could go on to get to other places. So this is how you would go down to New Rochelle. This is the road to Mamaroneck Road. You had Secor Road, which was then called the Road to White Plains. And then you had Griffin Avenue, which was called something else, and I'm not sure that it was actually a road then. It may have been just within somebody else's property. But that's basically it. But the other interesting thing about this map that's helpful to understand is that at this time, there were really 2 Scarsdales. There was all of the settlements along Post Road you think of like Wayside Cottage now, like there were a bunch of wayside cottages, houses of that era or slightly later, of which only a couple are left. The Cudner Hyatt house is left, at least the facade is, A couple other things are left. So you'll find those along Post Road. Then you had a different settlement over here. Over here you had the Quakers, Quaker Ridge. They settled there irrespective of the borders. So they settled there right along sort of Weaver Street and up here, but they lived across the way in New Rochelle and across the way to Mamaroneck, and they had their own Quaker school. So you had the school district over here. There was always a school on Post Road where the kids would go to, but then you would also have this different school district over here where those kids would go to. And another bit of ancillary trivia, the Mamaroneck Strip, if any of you live there or know of it, that's grandfathered in. That goes all the way back to this. Because there were people who would go to that Quaker school who did not live in Scarsdale. And that was just grandfathered in, grandfathered in, grandfathered in. Eventually that border was set at the Mamaroneck Strip, but that's why you have that oddity, because the school district and the municipal district didn't match up. All right. So, but if you want to see the school, this is what it looks like. This is around 1890. This would be on the corner of Weaver Street and Quaker Ridge Road. Quaker Ridge Road would have been basically right over there, and Weaver Street would have been behind us. So this is basically in the parking lot of that farm stand. And it's an exceptional photo because you can see on the right side, you see 5 black children, which was unusual for the era. There was a school for black students in New Rochelle, but they fought for the right to have an integrated school. So they were ahead of their time, certainly, in that way. So particularly amazing. All right. So you got the old days, pretty much static. In comes the railroad in the 1840s. That's going to connect Scarsdale to New York and attract some wealthier people. This is the old station. Originally when it came in, there in fact was no station in Scarsdale. It only stopped at Hart's Corners, which is now named Hartsdale. Scarsdale was sparse enough that it really wasn't even worth stopping here. A couple of fun things to point out about this. I mean, you have your communication here, the American Express with the wires. And you can see that like half of the station, at least in area, is devoted to freight, right? You got a freight line. This is not a commuter station back then. And there's reports on the paper even into the 20th century of people getting delivered large things like cows. They'd load them off the train, have them here, then somebody would come down, the Detterer family would come down from Edgemont and pick up their cows and walk them back up Ardsley Road to home. So that's kind of cool. So this was not daily commuting. This was a steam train coming in and dropping off stuff, and you could go back and forth. So you wouldn't go daily, but you could go weekly or for the weekend. So the character of Scarsdale started to change, and it went from almost exclusively farming to wealthier people coming in and having some weekend/summer estates. So this is the estate of Charles Butler, who bought up a tenth of Scarsdale, starting in 1853, about 400 acres, what's now known as Fox Meadow. That was his estate, Fox Meadow. And the large building behind is a greenhouse. So, holy moly. It's really something. So really, really exceptional. And I'll tell you, if you leave the library, when you go out to Post Road, if you look on the left, some of the original Fox Meadow gates, you could kind of just see it over there. And a recreation of it is on the right side. Basically, it might be too dark, but if you come back and you walk it, you'll see. And that's really wild. So then, these wealthier people start to create institutions in town that survive today. St. James the Less, which was founded in 1849, and the population is slowly rising. So you get this modest farm community plus the estates. And at this point, though, I would not consider Scarsdale remarkable, and it's difficult for me to trace the Scarsdale then to the Scarsdale now. The character, to me, it seems not so clear. But what does start to change it is suburbanization, which starts initially around 1890, slowly. So this is New York City, Mulberry Street in about 1900. I'm guessing that looking back on it, people would feel, or looking at a photo of it, people would feel more nostalgic than actually living there. So this probably would not be where the typical Scarsdale resident came from, but nonetheless, New York City was crowded. And what you started to have for the very first time was an appetite to get away, plus the ability to get away. Namely, well, I'd say, during most of the 1800s, where you lived and where you worked, they would have to be connected by walking, either by you walking or an animal walking and pulling you. So not that much difference. There was some elevated trains in New York, early, very, very slow elevated trains. But basically, you lived and you worked very, very close together. There wasn't really such a thing as a commute. It started to become possible with, at this point, starting to become possible with trains, and then of course in the coming decades, cars. But suburbs were a totally new thing at this point. It really wasn't even a concept at that point. In comes the Arthur Suburban Home Company. So this is the brochure of, they bought 150 acres in Edgewood, the very good on Post Road. On the left side, right as you hit Eastchester, is Arthur Manor. 150 acres. They bought a farm and gridded it up and started to change Scarsdale from a rural area to a suburban setting. What's fun about this, you may not be able to see unless you're in the front row, but down here you can see it's ex-President Arthur. And a nice picture of Chester A. Arthur here, who had nothing to do with the area. The owner of the farm was a man named George Arthur, who had a pretty poor reputation for being a jerk. So this is what they put there. And interestingly, the rumor about Chester A. Arthur's involvement in it, whether directly or through brothers or sisters or whatever, persisted for probably 50 years. Every 10 years there'd be something in the Inquirer about that, something like that. But this was just sheer puffery. If you recognize, several of the names of the directors are, in true developer fashion, are also names of streets in Arthur Manor. And some of them, like Clarence Gaylor got 2 streets. He got his first name and his last name in there. And Webster White. Swartwout, thankfully, no. So in comes Arthur Manor. That's the first development. And we get in 1902, we get a new railroad station, despite the fact that there's few commuters. And I will preview this. There's a film that's going to be coming out next year by the Historical Society on the development of downtown Scarsdale specifically. But that building there, the train station, which still exists today, was the originator of the Tudor Revival style in Scarsdale. That's where that came from, and everybody subsequently was copying that or copying a building that was copying that. But that's why Scarsdale is Tudor, which is pretty wild. So all through the first decade of the 1900s, people are complaining there's terrible rail service, because also it's steam locomotives. If you know, like a steam locomotive is like a big, heavy thing that takes a long time to get up to speed. Electric is much faster if you've driven an electric car or like a bumper car or something like that. It's almost instantaneous. When the tracks were electrified in 1910, that was a big change. People stopped complaining about the service. It got much faster. So that was a huge thing. So this is an awesome photo because there's a few things about it just to point out. One, you can see up here to East Parkway, empty. I'll show you a better photo in a second. No downtown yet. There's just a train station there. There's no overpass. We don't need the overpass because the tracks are not electrified. So you can walk straight across, which people do. They walk on this little path, and you can see there's a boardwalk here, and you just kind of walk across the boardwalk, and away you go. And there's a few other things. There's also what appears to be a car, an early car here, and a horse over here. So you've got that interesting era where they're coinciding. And in fact, in Scarsdale, it seems like for freight, for trucks, Horses stuck around much longer than for passenger use. So this is very, very early on. And in 1910, here's the reverse angle. This is 1907. So we're looking down from Overhill Road. There's nothing here. There's Popham Road here, Scarsdale Avenue here, right? So this would be, there's a parking lot here and a big building here. What used to be Metro Diner is here. Dentist's office there. All of the buildings along East Parkway, Harwood Building, nothing's there. The infrastructure, the basic infrastructure is there. So you've got the train station down here and all of Edgemont up on the hill here. But that's it, so it's not the most attractive place to live yet because there's no place to go to do your shopping. Just a few businesses in Scarsdale at this point. You're starting to get a little development though. The Heathcote Neighborhood Association starts up in 1904, Green Acres in 1912. But this is still very, very early. This is, doesn't look a lot like modern Scarsdale. This is the era when modern Scarsdale happens. So this is 1910, really to 1945. And I think each one of these factors is important. Scarsdale flourishes with a professional class takeover, village planning, and community volunteerism. Really all three of those kind of go together to turn Scarsdale into what it is now. So you've got, this is a later photo, but you've got waves of professionals moving in who have different ideas about schools and taxation than the people who traditionally lived here. But because the area was sparsely enough developed, unlike other areas, they were able to form a critical mass rather quickly. So in this way, Scarsdale actually leapfrogged other areas, the areas along the water, that were more developed. If you have, the example is if you're a farmer, you don't want high taxes on land, right? You don't want a lot of investments in certain things that are going to cost you money. If you're a banker and you aspire for your kids to go to college, you're going to look at this very differently. You can come to consensus a lot quicker if there are fewer older residents or longtime residents. And Scarsdale, because it was more of a blank slate, then what you have then in this era is two ideas. There's a progressive idea then of improving society through government. And so that's what you had here. You have these, actually maybe on the next page. I'll stick to this one. You have these elite heavy hitters coming to Scarsdale and forming what's essentially a shadow legislature named the Town Club. That's the predecessor to today's forum. But I think it was a very, very different animal, similar in sort of definition, but in actuality. So these would be some of the folks involved in that. Notice anything? What Scarsdale attracted, the types of people Scarsdale attracted, were businessmen and their families who needed to be closer to New York City. The idle rich could live up in Bedford and ride horses, but they weren't going to be going back and forth to New York City every day. So these were people who were really sort of engaged in their careers in New York City, and oftentimes very, very high-powered careers. And they were looking to give their time to the community, to create a community sort of in this professional image. So you have the Town Club. It starts up in 1904, and it's a way to kind of give guidance to and oversight of the local government. But what it actually wound up being really was this shadow government, that it said that the village board, at that time the town board, never actually did anything contrary to what the Town Club did, because those were really, I wouldn't say in charge, but they had a lot of expertise and a lot of influence. It was a system that was undemocratic. It was exclusive. The first black man wasn't admitted to the Town Club until 1960. I don't know when the first Jewish man was, but it would have been long after the arrival of the first Jewish person in town. No women until 1977. It was deemed exclusively a men's club. But it was very, very effective. So it almost has a parallels, I think, with a lot of what's happening in America and really the world, where you have to kind of hold two ideas in your head at the same time of people who by today's standards are not the most enlightened, who also did good things. That's kind of it. And where you wind up along that continuum is kind of up to you. But these guys did great things, and if you're a resident of Scarsdale, you enjoy those things today because of what they did. But everybody was not included in that process. Whether it's schools, taxes, infrastructure, it said that the village board rarely defied them. So I'll give you an example of that, which I think might help. So if anybody lives in Green Acres, so Green Acres was separated from the rest of Scarsdale by the enormous Fox Meadow estate. So it was really oriented more towards Hartsdale, using the Hartsdale train station, and up to White Plains, where you would do your shopping. You would not come down to Scarsdale because there really wasn't anything there anyway. So you really were a part of Scarsdale, but you weren't part of Scarsdale. In the early 1900s, White Plains started making moves to annex Green Acres into its own area. And if you recall what happened to Eastchester, what happened to Yonkers, what happened to all those other places, towns don't have control over their borders. The legislature can do it. So if White Plains can go to Albany and get the legislators on their side, Scarsdale will lose Green Acres. Scarsdale was the smallest town in Westchester, so that could have been the beginning of the end. Because it could have been that if Greenburgh is right next door to Scarsdale and decides that Scarsdale's downtown or Scarsdale's train station is advantageous to it, that could conceivably be grabbed too. You could have been divvied up among everyone else. The town club formed a committee with a judge at its head and wound up in 1913 realizing that if Scarsdale incorporated as a village has control over its own borders. So that's why Scarsdale is a village and a town with the exact same borders. It was done in 1915 for the explicit reason of having control, of not losing Green Acres, and honestly, possibly not getting picked apart by the neighboring municipalities. So that's why we have that control today, and that was something that came out of the town club. Now maybe somebody else could have come up with that idea too, but that was the sort of thing that they were doing, having long-lasting beneficial effects for us. So out of the women's suffrage movement in the late teens also came the Women's Club, which was also very influential in Scarsdale as well. Sort of different, I wouldn't say a parallel organization, but also extremely influential. This Women's Club created a lot of organizations in town that later became separate organizations. The Scarsdale Adult School, Friends of the Scarsdale Library, Scarsdale Edgemont Family Counseling. It bought the failing Scarsdale Inquirer in 1919 for $1, and it was failing, and published it for 40 years, staffing it almost exclusively by women. So here you have Ruth Chalmers, the long-term editor, who promoted this strong editorial stance of establishing Scarsdale's identity as a place of quality services, strict zoning, open space, superior schools. So she was editor for decades. Scarsdale's Inquirer developed a great reputation for forcefulness and fairness, integrity, and when she decided to retire in 1959, the Scarsdale Women's Club didn't attempt to replace her and instead just sold the paper. So this is her there, and one of the real landmark Scarsdalians of the first half of the century. Another major influence over Scarsdale's identity is the nonpartisan system. And I'll tell you, it also came out of some stuff that's a little bit undemocratic, certainly back then, possibly today as well, depending on your point of view, but had real long-term benefits. So, in 1911, the Democrats and Republicans, Scarsdale was mostly a Republican town, but there were some Democrats who had power. The Democrats and Republicans came to sort of a power-sharing thing, so that way they could govern effectively without fighting over the elections. This process changed a bit over the years, but basically you would have a citizens nominating committee in those early days. A few folks would get together in a room, talk about who would be good trustees, good mayor, and they would decide among themselves, and then they would go out and tell them. And that was traditionally an offer that you didn't refuse. So it's obviously a very clubby process, because I've heard of people saying, oh yeah, my father lived in town, he wanted to be involved, but he was Jewish, so he couldn't be part of the town club, so he wouldn't be on the list. So this is yet another one of those things where a lot of these people made great decisions because they weren't running for office, right? You weren't aligned with a party. You didn't have to make promises and then keep them no matter what you later learned about what was really happening. So candidates were chosen not on their stated beliefs, but on their ability to respond to the needs of what came before the village board, which is a really smart way to do things. And yes, it has the flavor of not being democratic, but as far as effectiveness, I think it's sort of undeniable. In the early 30s, the process started getting a little bit more democratic. They started having other people in the room to help decide it. And today, those people are elected. The people who decide that are elected, and then they will nominate somebody who doesn't run unopposed by law, can be opposed by somebody else if they want to. But this was the idea, and I think it did give Scarsdale efficient and honest and effective government for many, many years, and until today. You generally get very good people. I think always get very good people who are involved in this. But of course, all religious and ethnic groups aren't represented, nor in large part on the village side, women were largely not included in this process. So following the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, 2 women were put on the board, and a couple more held terms in the 20s, and then from 1930 till 1943, all of the positions were held by men. And after that, not until the 70s did more than one woman serve on the board at any given time. So definite underrepresentation, and the first woman mayor wasn't until Jean Stone in 1981. It's kind of crazy. It shows a real underrepresentation, obviously, but this isn't a Scarsdale problem, right? We haven't had a woman president. They're underrepresented in all parts of government, whether they're elected or appointed or whatever. So it's not a Scarsdale problem. It was just sort of an American problem at the time, or issue. So back to the identity, other things. Schools. So back to that farmer, right? The farmer in some other community doesn't want higher taxes. The banker does. He wants better schools. He doesn't want to have to pay for his kid to go away to boarding school. He'd rather have the local schools be really good. So because the upper middle class professionals dominated Scarsdale by the 20s, that was able to happen. So this is the high school in 1926. Ability to pay taxes was greater, but also taxes became greater. But schools became priority number 1 in Scarsdale much, much earlier than they did in other places. Here's a fun ad from the Inquirer. You can see Scarsdale's number 1 industry. Of interest to parents, start him on his career path right. In the schools of Scarsdale, whose educational system holds first rank in New York State, surround him with the right playmates and yourself and your family with congenial neighbors. Live in a fine new apartment in the heart of Scarsdale's social and recreational life. I mean, it's a little on the nose, but that's basically the same message today. All right. So going back to downtown, I'll talk about the commercial development, which you'll be able to see a whole movie on in a couple months. In 1920, most people went to White Plains to do their shopping. There was vacant land, where East Parkway is now, owned by the Popham family, and it was feared that out-of-town speculators were going to come in, buy up this land, and put up cruddy one-story buildings. Scarsdale businessmen united to protect Scarsdale. They kind of pooled their resources and founded Scarsdale Improvement Corporation, first President Rush Wilson, and bought the land to build on it. And just in a few years, this is around 1915, you've got the train station over here on the left. This is East Parkway. That's Scarsdale Avenue. Popham Road is running left to right. So in just a few years, you go from this, 1915, to this. This should be around 1923. So we are looking at Spencer Place here, The train tracks are running over here by the power lines. This is East Parkway. And this is the first building where Chase Bank is in downtown. So the Harwood building is not here. The rest of the buildings are not here yet, any of the things along Spencer Place. But they started on the corner of Popham and built their way this way. You may be able to see using horses for work. It's really cool. I mean, this is the 20s, so pretty neat. Harwood building comes in 1928, if I didn't say so. And then we have this. This is East Parkway from the reverse angle, colorized photo, obviously. This is pretty cool. So this is where the Chase is. Zacky's used to be here. Maybe that's the guitar shop here, one of these. If you go down there, not to give away too much of the film, but we have these awnings here, like pre-air conditioning, right? So that way you can shelter your apartment, keep your windows open, but not get direct sunlight in. If you walk along the sidewalk here and look up at some of these windows, you can still see these rods that were used to support the awnings that have been gone for decades. So that's kind of cool. But it's definitely worth a walk down there because they put a lot of money into those buildings that they didn't need to. They really went above and beyond to create a quality downtown. So, the next thing I want to talk about is zoning, another thing that contributed to Scarsdale's identity. This is a proposed complex in Fox Meadow that never happened. So I'll give you the background. In 1922, the Souchard Chocolate Factory wanted to open up a factory by the Five Corners. Scarsdale residents were outraged. So that didn't happen. And Scarsdale implemented the first suburban zoning in New York State in 1922, establishing Scarsdale as a community legally of primarily single-family homes. They didn't want factories, tenements, saloons. The Bronx was kind of like a cautionary tale of unchecked development because the Bronx started out looking a lot like Scarsdale and developed into something much, much denser by design. So if you think about, for example, Post Road, there's no businesses on Post Road except for one and a half. There's the gas station on the corner of Popham, and there's a telephone exchange that you really wouldn't know that it exists as you head towards White Plains on the left side, almost when you get to the high school, but it almost looks like a regular building. That's because of zoning. If you go up into White Plains or down into Eastchester, the character changes completely. It's because of zoning, not because of preferences. It's also narrower by design. Scarsdale wanted Post Road to be narrower, so next time you're going down Post Road and feeling really uncomfortable, like somebody's going to come in your lane, you have those early trustees to thank. So in 1924, Emily Butler, daughter of Charles Butler, who we saw in that photo earlier, sold the Fox Meadow 360 acres. Sold 360 acres of Fox Meadow for $1.5 million. Oof. To the Jacobs brothers. They had previously developed the Garth property by Garth Road after David Garth died. So they chopped it up, sold sites for private homes, but then they wanted to do this. And the village and the residents did not go for that. That was not going to happen. Then I shall keep it there. So for 50 years now, Scarsdale has pursued this through building code, minimum acreage requirements, laws preventing mass constructed similar looking houses, Board of Architectural Review. There's obviously, as we're seeing today, positives and negatives to this approach. You can argue about how effective things have been, but that's been the specific intent for over 100 years, is to keep Scarsdale's character like this. So by 1930, Scarsdale really starts to look like modern Scarsdale. And one of the ways I sort of think about it is if you went into a Rip Van Winkle coma in 1800 and woke up in 1900, you'd kind of know what was happening. It wouldn't be that bad. But if you went into a coma in like 1915 and woke up in 1930 in Scarsdale, you'd be completely disoriented. That's how much change had occurred. So this is 1924. This is an awesome photo for a few reasons. Well, I mean, you got the station, and this looks a lot like today with the commuters. But if you remember the boardwalk to go across the tracks. Well, these tracks have been electrified for 14 years. They put up a fence here so people couldn't walk across because people for their entire lives have been walking across tracks. We don't need the fence anymore because people know not to do it. But they put up a fence here, but you could still see the old path was still there. So the pavement was still there, but then it just kind of truncates right here, and you have to go across either up here or by on Popham Road. So in the 20s, the population of Scarsdale grew by 51%. But the population of Scarsdale, I said Westchester grew by 51%, Scarsdale by 176%. From 3,500 in 1920 to almost 10,000 in 1930. Well, today we're at 18,000. So it's sizable. It's really starting to get pretty similar. This was due to the electrified train service. We had gas coming in, so now you could have modern appliances. The Bronx River Parkway was finished in 1925. And then you start to have early spending on quality municipal services. Here's a cartoon from 1925. From the left to right, federal tax cut, guys read. And I like this for a couple reasons. It's not a particularly funny cartoon, but in 1925, it's illustrating like this is the everyman. And what's the everyman doing? He's taking the subway to the train to his suburban home. That's like a new thing. It's like a typical thing. So anyway, he's on the subway, federal tax cut, taxes to be reduced. He's on the train, Mellon plan, tax cut. Coolidge sets fashion, government economy as he sits on his Scarsdale porch. Then he gets his village tax notice for 1925 and is complaining that maybe Scarsdale isn't so up to date after all. It's all right, but this is this cartoon could have been made for decades and decades and decades later up till today. The reason for this was spending on schools and spending on quality municipal services, which has, it makes it a better place to live. Higher taxes, though, also keep out many people who can't afford to live here. That's just it. So because of that, Scarsdale has been less socially diverse, less economically diverse than other surrounding communities. All right, you don't need to see the details of this. I want to just talk a moment that what you've seen so far is basically how Scarsdale's identity was formed. You've got the zoning, you've got the downtown development, the schools, the taxes, etc. But this is just interesting to see because I think it's kind of faded from view. So this is World War II. In World War II in Scarsdale, almost 2,200 young people served and 80 people lost their lives. Not spread out evenly over the period of World War II, but really concentrated in the heavy years, particularly in 1944. So imagine picking up your Scarsdale Inquirer or getting it in December 8th, 1944. All of the red ones are killed in action. All of the yellow ones are somebody wounded or missing in action. It's unthinkable today, given what you would see in the Inquirer, which could be about something that's not so emotionally weighted. And this was the existence of Scarsdale during World War II, and it was amazing. I'll just share a couple other things and how you got the news. So everyone in town would have known somebody who lost a child to the war. Most likely 80 kids in town, right? All of a certain age. You would have had some connection to that. I'll show you just what the telegrams looked like. So they didn't come to your door with like the two people in the movies and tell you something happened. You just got a telegram. So this is actually one that I just saw. This is what my great-grandmother got about her son. You just get something. This is regret to inform you, your son was on 23rd of March, seriously wounded in action, the European area, and you'll be advised as reports of condition are received. So you would see things in the paper that somebody gets news, and then 6 months later you would see they got another telegram that said when they died. It's the life of a parent during that era of a child who was serving is this is an unrelated one, Minnesota, but You just get a telegram 3 lines long. Your son died, or your son was killed. So I'm not sure why this sort of the memory of World War II has kind of faded so much, and I don't know whether it's just as a factor of time and that's what happens, or whether it's Vietnam, the bad war washed away the feelings from the good war. I'm not sure what that is. I think it's an interesting topic to explore because it was a very traumatic event and it's not really thought of much. So I'll just run through real quick. You've got Scarsdale's identity pretty much already established. I'll just tell you some of the changes in society since the Second World War. Then if you have questions, in about 5 minutes we'll get to a whole bunch of questions, anything you want, and that'll be good. So by the 50s, Scarsdale looked really similar to today's Scarsdale, except in the composition of who lived here. It was really dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants up through the 50s. And in 1943, there were 3,500 registered Republicans, fewer than 700 Democrats, so 5 to 1, and 33 American laborites, but not many of those in Scarsdale. And then you can see what the station looked like. This looks a lot like now. Everybody's grouped by the doors, ready to hop on the train that's coming in. It's electrified. You can see it's, it's different because it's all men, right? I guess today probably half of these guys are home in their bathrobes anyway on Zoom. But the religious composition, though, did change. So the Catholic population of Scarsdale has been relatively steady between 18-22% from 1940 to 1980. But what really changed was the decline in the number of Protestant families in town and the increase in the number of Jewish families in town. That they really kind of sort of swapped places. Before World War II, there were some Jews in Scarsdale, but they really weren't part of Scarsdale's society, and they were, in fact, steered away by local realtors. Now, the wealthiest could always buy their way in. Al Jolson came in 1923, but that's like Michael Jackson coming to your town, like Michael Jordan. That's not representative of the average person who's going to be able to get in there. Fox Meadow was developed. The Jacobs brothers were Jewish, so that opened up some possibilities, but it really wasn't until after World War II that there started to be greater acceptance. WRT was founded in 1953, Scarsdale Synagogue in 1960. But in the 60s, you could see new families moving in were disproportionately Jewish. Those moving out at that point were disproportionately Protestant. And Scarsdale was also changing from mostly Republican in that era to mostly Democratic. I don't know if those things are linked or it's just a change in the feeling. The black population of Scarsdale has been low. This is a chart going all the way back from colonial days to today. If you want to know more about this, I've got a full presentation online on the history of black people in Scarsdale. It goes into tons more detail about why. But basically, you've got the black resident percentage. So these are farm workers up here. Then it kind of comes down, and you get this bulge here, which looks encouraging that the black resident percentage is going up in the early part of the 1900s. But if you chart it against the percentage of black households, you'll see they're diverging. And the reason for that is this is live-in help. This is women, single women or women without their children living in the homes of Scarsdale residents, not sending their children to Scarsdale schools, not really part of it, but still counted on the census. So the household percentage is really the more relevant number, which has been between 1 and 2% for 100 years. So not so encouraging. This is a result of, during the suburban era, legal and illegal discrimination. During the last few decades, it's been underrepresentation based on many economic reasons, possibly discrimination as well, some preferences. There were efforts starting in the 1960s, which I talked about in the video, to increase the percentage of black people from about the 60s up through the 80s with some positive effects, but obviously not complete because we're now at about 2% today, which doesn't match population of black people in the U.S. as a whole, or in Westchester County, which is I think 14%. All right, and then last slide before I just plug a couple things. Over the past couple decades, Scarsdale, though, has gotten more diverse, particularly in Asian and international. So Scarsdale is about 1/6 Asian representation now, which has happened relatively quickly, and it's encouraging. There are fewer barriers now to the full participation of women in the civic life of the town, and there's still the culture of volunteerism. And then I will give a couple more things. All the videos, just go to the Scarsdale Historical Society webpage. We've got films on every neighborhood in town. If you have any photos, if you happen to have any photos in your online collections and you'd like them to wind up in our archives, feel free to send them to me. And I'll leave that up, and I think we could turn on the lights, and if you have questions, we can answer some questions. I will repeat them, and thank you so much.